in 2019, the first time capsule buried by Stumpy Sanderson and his gang of mischievous working-class boys, and which was actually an old Watney's Party 7 can, was unearthed. Then in 2023, the second time capsule, which was an old Courage Jackpot Bitter Party can, was discovered. And now, Whistling 5 Anarchic Productions, in conjunction with the 1970s Cigarette Appreciation Club and Puffer Patterson's Benevolent Fund for Aging Thespians, proudly presents Series 2 of Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s stories, and the 22 stories found in that second time capsule. As narrated by Andrew Brammer. Bonjour, bon après-midi, et bonsoir. The story you are about to hear is narrated in the first person, because I, just like Stumpy, witnessed firsthand the momentous events which it describes. So, let's park up the rally chopper, dim the lava lamp, switch off that episode of Catweasel, finish up the plate of Vesta beef curry, crack open a can of Double Diamond, light up a mannequin cigar, and kick back, sit back, and listen in to the anarchic and outrageous japes, scrapes and capers of Stumpy Sanderson and his gang. For this story, we head back to 1974 for A Bag of Scrumps. Just outside one of the villages on the outskirts of Dunstable that we sometimes biked to was a strange-looking and imposing derelict brick and concrete government building that must have been built sometime during the Second World War. It was totally deserted, with barbed wire-topped fencing all around its large perimeter, and there were old and weathered warning signs saying, "Keep out, Ministry of Defence," and "Prohibited Area." As we had never seen any human presence there at all, or military personnel, we quite reasonably assumed it was no longer in use. That was until Nobby Russet, one of the small bumpkin village lads who we sometimes bumped into, called out to me, Stumpy, and Bendy Henderson as we were cycling along at a fair pace on a warm summer's day, and flagged us down. "Hi, Nobby, how's things? You look pretty excited," said Stumpy. "Yeah, hi lads. Thought you might be interested in something. There have been some strange goings-on at that old government building. How do you fancy scrumping some huge fruits? Apples as big as shot-puts, pears as big as tins of ham, and cherries as big as tennis balls?" Our eyes nearly popped out on stalks. "Crikey, what do you mean, strange goings-on and scrumping huge fruits?" we asked, our attention now clearly piqued. "Well, a few weeks back I was out that way and saw some big cars and a large removal truck arrive. The blokes in the cars were all wearing dark suits, while the guys in the truck were wearing dark green boiler suits. They unlocked the main gates, and before they went in, they made a point of looking around to make sure no one was watching. I, of course, made sure I hid from view, but I had a good vantage point, and with my adventure kit binoculars, was able to watch what they were up to." "Which was?" asked Bendy. "Well, out of the truck, the boiler-suited blokes got out a dozen small trees, which they then started planting, all the while with the suited guys looking on." "Well, that does sound bizarre," said Stumpy. "Yeah, particularly when they then got out some weird-looking tins with those radioactive warning signs on them, and poured whatever liquid was in them round the trees." Nobby then dropped to the bombshell part of his strange tale. "But that's not everything. After I watched them leave, I decided to go back the next week, and those trees they had planted were unbelievable. They had grown massive in size, and had fruits on their branches the sizes of what I told you." "Good grief!" exclaimed Bendy. "This we've got to see." This was indeed so very odd that we now urgently needed to take a ride out there, and so all four of us duly set off. With the sun on our backs, we rode hard to reach the building and its grounds, which as usual were totally deserted. Parking up our bikes, we walked alongside the rusting perimeter fence, and, even from where we were, we could see the dozen huge trees laden with their enormous fruit. We then all took it in turns to borrow Nobby's binoculars to take a closer look, and were all astonished and flabbergasted at the sheer size of those apples, pears, and cherries. "Struth! Look at the size of those fruits! Imagine how much we could get for that lot if we were able to pick and sell them," said Stumpy. Nobby's freckled face broke into a huge grin. "Just what I was thinking. And guess what else I've discovered?" "What?" we asked. "A way in. Last week I found a hole in the fence, and it's large enough for us to get through." This was incredible news, and so we could now put a scrumping plan into operation. However, realising we only had one carrier bag between us, the wavy line one that Stumpy had swinging off his handlebars, and which contained our supplies of Golden Wonder crisps and bottles of Cresta, and mindful of the fact that it was now getting a bit late in the afternoon, and that Stumpy, Bendy and I had to get back to Dunstable, we knew we would have to work fast, and that today's picking would only be a limited trial run. And so, with Nobby keeping watch to make sure those strange men didn't reappear, Stumpy, Bendy and I wormed our way through the fence and scooted to the trees. Bendy and Stumpy shinned up one of the apple trees, and then began picking and throwing the huge apples down to me, which I duly loaded into our large carrier bag. When we had finished our illicit work, and in no time at all had filled the bulging carrier bag, we could not believe the giant green apple's monstrous size. We now realised, though, that our next problem was how to get our spoils back. With the size of those enormous fruits that we had plundered and picked, there was no way that either Stumpy, Bendy or I would be able to get the bag back to Dunstable along the main roads on our bikes. So we all decided that we would stash our afternoon's pickings in Nobby's dad's shed. We also decided that the next day Nobby would go out like a peddler with some of these huge apples and knock on some doors around the village to test the market. This was because we couldn't make it back the next day, as we had a big cricket match on up at the local rec. The plan was that we would then join up with Nobby again the day after that, and if his market test had been as successful and demand as high as we anticipated, we would all then return to the government building to pick the rest of the plentiful fruit. We would also put our brains together to find a way to get the gigantic fruits transported back to Dunstable, which was a far larger potential market for us. However, when we did head back to the village the day after next, Stumpy, Bendy and I were astonished to see barricades with quarantine signs blocking the road, preventing any entry to the village, and soldiers, policemen, and men dressed in white protective clothing going from house to house. Ambulances and medics were in abundance, and what looked like a field hospital had been set up. We also saw large cars parked up, and some men in dark suits, which must have been the same men Nobby had told us about, who had gone into that strange government establishment. As we slowly cycled up to the main barrier, a large policeman looked down at us. "Can't go in there or any further, lads, I'm afraid. The whole village has been shut off and quarantined." We were stunned. "Why, what's gone on?" asked Stumpy. "Can't say, but whatever it is, it's top secret. The military are involved." We never did find out what exactly had happened to the village over those very strange days. And a week or so later, when all the authorities had finally left the area, no one who lived in that village could remember anything whatsoever that had happened to them. There was also absolutely nothing at all mentioned in the local newspapers. Even Nobby, when we were able to finally catch up with him, just laughed and looked at us as if we were mad when we tried to tell him what we had all picked at that strange establishment all those days ago, and about our plan to sell the fruit for a tidy sum. And when we finally persuaded him to at least bike out to that mysterious building so that we could show him what we were talking about and try to awaken him from his memory loss, when we arrived at the establishment, all those fruit trees had been removed, and the place looked as if nothing untoward or unusual had ever happened there in the first place. However, when a few vague rumours eventually began leaking out some time after that during those days there had been an onset and outbreak of unexplained mysterious symptoms, mass hallucinations, and unpleasant sickness on an industrial scale in the village, with thankfully no one seriously harmed, Stumpy, Bendy and I eventually came to the conclusion that Nobby must have done a roaring trade in the village with his door-to-door selling of those enormous, scrumped apples. Thank you for listening to this episode of Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories. And please don't forget to check out the other stories from Series 2 and Series 1. You can also follow Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories on Facebook, where you can keep up to date with all the news about live shows and other Stumpy events. There's also the website, www.stumpysanderson.co.uk, and the Stumpy Sanderson's 1970s Stories YouTube channel. And you can get in touch with me at andrew@stumpysanderson.co.uk. Until the next story, au revoir et bonne nuit, and keep grooving.
Yeah. This podcast has been recorded using a DIY punk rock philosophy. Yeah.